Okay, hopefully for the last time. I've left these drawings up here. I think I've got a little too attached to them. I'm going to have to practice my inner Buddha and detach for next year and erase these things. But they're here because I'm going to use them to talk about the true meaning of Christmas. Now, we've done the true meaning of Christmas several times before. At the end of this video, I'll link it to people who haven't seen it before, talking about the meaning of Christ and the virgin birth and the North Star and all those types of things. We'll link it to that. But we're going to talk about one of my favorite little clever therapeutic features of the idea of Christmas, looking at it a little bit different. But to review, for those who have seen it before, or to describe it to people who haven't seen it before, this little drawing here represents all of existence. It's very Tao-based, but also science-based, and ultimately very spiritual. This concept really quickly. We have the Big Bang. We have the beginning, the origin of all things. I have the source or God, whatever you want to call it. In the very least, all of us can agree there was some sort of beginning, at least as it relates to us. And from that beginning comes all the stuff, all the people, money, birds, little people, bigger people, money, that's peanut butter jelly sandwiches. And the spirit also comes from it. Everything comes from this source known as the Big Bang or the Tao. Part of that leads to separation. The idea of what the human ego is the thing that sees things as separate. It's a really simple concept. You're different than I am. That's separation. These people are different than me. They're better than me. They're worse than me. Whatever the case may be. That's ego. That's separation. That's also darkness. All of that comes from this Big Bang. And notice how everybody is still connected to that source. Well, this thing called the spirit also comes from the Big Bang. It's just the perception or the opposite of what ego is. It's the perception or the energy of unity and things working together for good, as opposed to arguing and the differences and all of that. The spirit is the thing that says everybody is somehow similar. In the very least, we all come from the same source. And I would suggest we all come from the same source, and our job while we're here is to figure out we come from that source. That's it. And you might have a completely different angle than I do based upon where you were born, what gender you are, what religion was forced upon you, what language was forced upon you, what culture was forced upon you. All that is conditioning. And your job is to figure out how you relate to the source. Same with me, okay? And so we're all playing the same game from different angles. That's this drawing. And over here I have the Pac-Man example of a human being playing Pac-Man. And this human being knows that Pac-Man is a character he's playing. And in that game, there's a ghost and there's cookies, and then the character does certain things. But the whole time the human being is playing that game, he's aware that he's not Pac-Man, he's just playing Pac-Man. Well, the metaphor, which flips back into this, is we are spiritual beings who come from the source, and we're playing this physical game. And this physical game includes playing football and birds, and there's a sun. But we have forgotten that we're not that we're the spiritual being, and we think we're the character. Buddha means to awaken, okay? I'm going to talk, when I talk about Christmas, it's ultimately the same thing. Is to realize the Christ within. That's the spirit of Christmas, ultimately. The birth of the Christ inside of each of us. And what that means, among other things, is the realization or the remembering that we're the spiritual essence that's inside this game. And when we forget that, we suffer. You might not want to lose Pac-Man, and Pac-Man dies, and you might not want that to happen. But since you know that it's a game, the suffering is different. If you really thought you were Pac-Man, you'd be terrified by those ghosts. Well, in the physical world, when you forget that you're a spiritual being, all of a sudden all the stuff inside the game becomes so much more terrifying, and it's why we suffer. The Buddha says we're attached to all the stuff inside the game, and that's why we suffer. And the entirety of Jesus' mission, ultimately, is to show us not to fear death and to teach us how to let go of all the stuff that's happening inside this game. Which brings us to Christmas, and a couple different ways of thinking about Christmas, okay? The most basic way Christmas is thought of is as Christ's Mass. Mass being a gathering or a service, mostly of Christian-minded, Christian-oriented people. And Christmas, Christ's Mass, is the way most people think of it, and that is the birth of the baby thousands of years ago. Again, I'll link you to the video in which I take a different perspective on that. But that's one way of looking at the word Christmas. It's Christ's Mass, and we do gather and celebrate Christ. Well, then there's Christmas, which is the Latin word for what the Mass comes from as Missa. Christ Missa. In Latin, Missa is ascending or going, and the way I perceive it, it's a mission. And Jesus himself, certainly as the story goes, had a mission that he had to live out. And so Christmas would mean Christ's mission. That works too. We can gather and celebrate Jesus. We could also focus on the fact that he had a mission to live out, and he certainly did. But the one that I want to emphasize from a therapeutic perspective is something I've never heard anyone talk about before, which is using Spanish and Christ mas. Because in Spanish, mas Christ, means more. And Christmas really, to me, means more Christ. That's it. And it can be about the celebration of a baby, and it can be the gathering of Christians together, and it can be the Jesus's mission. But for me personally, and again therapeutically, it means more Christ. I want more Christ for me. And therapeutically, Christ itself, the understanding of Christ and what it truly is, which is the spirit within, more spirit, that's the most therapeutic thing there is. It makes addictions go away. It heals mental health issues, right? It brings us peace. It brings us satisfaction. It brings us fulfillment. And so Christmas is more Christ, which is bringing spirit in. And so to apply Christmas that way is to look at the man Jesus, whose last name wasn't Christ, but he had the Christ within. And why did he have the Christ within? Well, he had all the wisdom and he applied it. He knew how to look at truths and live it out. And so I thought, all right, how do we get to more Christ? To just believe that Jesus was born of a virgin never really did it for me, and if that works for people, fine. But I wanted to understand and know what he knew and then try to apply it. And then I've done this for over 20 years now with myself and others, working on, all right, let's have some more Christ going on. And what is it? What is it that he taught? What is it that we're supposed to be following? And it's not enough just to believe that Jesus was born of a virgin, okay? If so, that would be the end of it. He wouldn't have had to teach anything. Why did he say you have to pick up your cross and follow me? Stuff like that. Because it's more than just believing in the birth of Jesus and the virgin birth. So I decided to just think about, all right, what verses come to my mind first? And how silly is it to try to limit Jesus to a small section on a whiteboard in some office somewhere? But I gave myself just that much space, because if I wrote down all the things that I liked that Jesus said, the whole board couldn't fill it, of course. So I left myself with this space, and I still got all that stuff in. And so I'd like to start with some of the most obvious, and I say two of my most favorite pieces of wisdom in therapeutic spiritual application. One comes from Jesus and one is the Buddha. The Buddha's is strive for your own liberation with diligence, okay? That means work on yourself. That's the only way it's going to work. Saving others is super hard to do, if not impossible. But the first and the most important piece of all spiritual teachings is Jesus when he says, seek and you will find. A few months ago, we talked about that. It always depends upon what you're seeking. If you're looking for your car keys, you seek them, you'll probably find them. You're more likely to find them if you don't seek them. If you seek a new job, you're more likely to find that job, but you might not. If you seek human relationships or human living circumstances or just a new pet, seek those things, you might find those things, but you also might not. When he says seek and you find, he's referring to the Spirit. Seek more Spirit, you will find more Spirit. He does not equivocate. And so if we look at Christmas as a physical thing involving a physical child and a physical mother and a father and the all the stories of the wise men and all of that, if you look at it physically, you get physical. If you look at it spiritually, you'll get spiritual. Okay? And so it's a wonderful teaching. Seek and you'll find, but what you're seeking matters. So it's great advice. Then the Lord's Prayer, the whole thing is quite useful. He talks about how we're supposed to pray. My favorite part of it is, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That means, as we've talked about many times before, there's something going on in this higher world, higher dimensional world, that we're supposed to learn how to apply here. In Hermetics, it's as above, so below. Heaven is the above, we're in the below. Multiple dimensions of space and time set that up pretty nicely. And if we are our higher self, and here's the key to Christmas, the higher self is the spiritual portion of all of us. If we can bring, Jesus will call that the Father, right? When we throw a body onto it because we're seeking physical, we think of a dude in the sky. But if you make the Father your higher self, and the ego aspect is the lower self, the goal is to bring heaven to earth, as it says in the Tao, to bring the Tao to earth, or have God's will be done through us. And it means connecting to the higher self. And that just ultimately means yourself operating at peak efficiency, which is the most spiritual self. And again, therapeutically, that's the way to look at it. What it means, thousands of years from now, I'm not quite sure, but I do know therapeutically it works to look at each other spiritually. And so, here comes a whole bunch of quick spiritual teachings to have more Christ in our lives at Christmas time. Starting with, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Now, simply, therapeutically, that means to trust everything that happens to you. Doesn't mean you have to like it. In Kabbalah, I just saw recently, they say that everything that's ever happened to you is happening to you for you to connect your divinity, for you to become equivalent with God. Okay, so stuff happens to teach you everything you need to learn so you can achieve Christ consciousness, so you can achieve Buddha nature, or so you can experience it. And so that means, and that's without exception, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. It means all of it. Not just 92% or only when things are going good. It means things like crucifixions, as Jesus went through. He still had to trust. It was hard. Take this cup from me, he said. But he knew, not my will be done, but thy will. He submitted, and he surrendered to it. Remember, Muslim means one who has surrendered. He submitted to the truth of God in the divine plan. He got himself out of the way. The ego, instead of trying to control things, he said, I'll surrender, and I'll just let it happen, and I'll let it flow through me. That's loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And Jesus says that's the most important commandment. And the other is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, that's bold. Who looks at their neighbor and thinks of them as, well, that's me. Who does that? Almost none of us. And not just neighbor, not just your next door neighbor. How about the one across the street, the one 10 houses down? How about the one the next state over? How about those that live in Syria? Right? All our neighbors, everyone else on earth. Do we love them as ourselves? Well, that's why I have this drawing up here still, as we talked about before. You have to figure out that through the Spirit, you are connected to the Big Bang. You're connected to the source, but so do they. And from that spot, we're all one. Down here, we're not one, and the ego is going to see that separation, this darkness. But when you perceive, as we talked about last week, when Krishna says that if you could perceive the unity in all beings, you'll attain the infinite spirit. That means I have to look at you and see you as a neighbor, see you as myself. And how is it? Because you look different than me, right? And we have a lot of differences, for sure. But how are we the same? Same spirit, same energy, same consciousness animating all of us. The consciousness in you got shaped the way you got shaped based upon where you were born, what got taught to you, the religion and the language and all that stuff. But at the beginning, at the root, the start of all of it, the source of all of it, we're the same. And that's how you can love another as oneself. That which helps me helps you, spiritually speaking. Patience helps us all. Forgiveness helps us all. Wisdom helps us all. But physical world stuff, we're going to argue over. Again, seek the spiritual, not the physical. And then love your enemy. I mean, that's a pretty high-level teaching. Christmas should be about loving our enemies. And we're not really doing that too well. And again, in Christianity, I don't understand how they don't see oftentimes that disagreeing with someone who disagrees with Jesus as the prophet, they're going to hell because that's always been an issue for me. He's saying to love those people, not tell them that they're wrong. The idea is to look at someone else and offer them the Spirit. That's the idea. And if we perceive ourselves as physical beings, and the only thing we have to do is remember this, that we're all coming from the same home base, if you will, then it's pretty easy to love your enemy. As I like to say, it doesn't mean you have to vote for them, it doesn't mean you have to hug them. But you do have to send spirit, and you can be graceful around a person. You could be both right and righteous. And to be just right is to get into arguments. Welcome to American political system. But can you be right and righteous at the same time? Now you're having your cake and eating it too. Now you're in the physical world, but you're being spiritual. That's Mas Christ. That's more Christ. Be righteous, and that means love your enemy. You're allowed to disagree with your enemy, right? You're allowed to recognize that they're in a different phase of growth. But love them, we must. That's more Christ. Don't worry about your life, what you eat, what you wear, okay, what you drink. And he says at least 7 times, I think it's in the Gospel of John, to not worry about things. He says it throughout the Gospels anyways, to not worry. Well, why is that? What good does worrying do, after all? It just adds a negative energy to things, okay? It's going to happen as it needs to happen. Awareness is the exact same quality without worry. The same experience of trusting will be felt much differently when you worry about things. Whether it's paying a bill or if you have a loved one who has has a doctor's appointment coming up and you're worried about the results of it, it doesn't help. What if you trust the results? Results are still going to be the results. But adding good, healthy energy to a system helps the body heal. You know, when we add negative energy and fear and shame and guilt into a system, it causes issues with the body. It also causes issues with Israel and Palestine and Christians versus Muslims and families and friends and, you know, all that kind of conflict that we have. Adding spirit, that always works. Adding worry doesn't work at all. So he says, not only should you not worry about that kind of stuff, but your whole life and what you eat and what you wear. The ego does the worrying. That's the separated self. That worries. The thing that's grounded back here at home base, that doesn't worry. The spirit's calm, cool, and collected. It's compassionate. It sees all as equals. And the Tao says to anchor yourself there. And if you're anchored in the Tao, what need is there to worry? Why do we use so many medicines like Xanax and Valium or drink alcohol to try to sedate ourselves? Why? Because we just don't want to feel that feeling of worry and stress. Well, the Spirit takes care of that. To trust and love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's the best sedative there is. And it works. It's very effective. That's Mos Christ. And that link I added here later. Talked about this a couple times recently. Jesus is the one that says to the fellow teachers of his day, he says, you're worried about tithing, dill, and mint, and cumin, when you should be focused on the weightier matters of the law, faith, justice, and mercy. And he's saying straight up, will you stop obsessing over physical world rules? The weightier matters of the law are faith, justice, and mercy. That's what we need to be applying. Mos Christ is to have a relationship or an experience with a person and lead with faith, justice, and mercy. That includes the justice part of it includes, guess what? We're all getting taught. We're in a spiritual playground, so to speak, and we're all learning and growing. That's why we've done the many levels of development. Luke 2:52, Jesus grew in stature and favor with God and man. Because he grew. We're all growing. I call it evolution of consciousness. So we're all in this experience together, and the way to grow is by adding faith, justice, and mercy and a bunch of other virtue. But if all we're worried about is making sure you get into the school before the bell rings, or to make sure you give the right amount of money to the church, or all these physical behaviors, we're not being spiritual. To be spiritual is to practice, as he says, the weightier matters of law, faith, justice, and mercy. And most of these teachings, again, you're going to see all of them are anchored in non-physical things. He said of himself, I can do nothing on my own. What a perfect little metaphor for this. We're physical beings temporarily. And the way we operate is based upon the energy inside of us. If we have ego, lower vibrational energy inside of us, we operate in accordance with that. If we have a higher vibrational energy, spiritual energy, we'll operate in accordance with that. This is when I use the lawnmower example. Lawnmowers are designed to do something. You put orange juice in that tank, it's not going to run very well. You put watered down gas in that tank, it's not going to run very well. But you put premium fuel into that tank, now the lawnmower is going to do what it needs to do. We are designed, as Paul says, we're creatures that God designed to do God's will. What is it? You'll do your best, you'll do your best, you'll do your best when you're filled with this thing called the Spirit. Jesus recognized, I can do nothing on my own. Can a lawnmower do anything without the fuel? No, it can do nothing on its own. It needs the energy. We are very poor actors of the Spirit when we fill ourselves with non-Spirit things. I can't be my best unless I'm filled with the Spirit. Jesus, who was clearly filled with the Spirit, said, I can do nothing on my own. He knows, as he says the rest of that verse, I judge as my Father tells me to judge. The higher self that was in him told him what to do, told him how to be. He knew that the lower self, the part that he allowed to get physically crucified, wasn't really who he was. It was a temporary experience. It was a dream figure in a dream state. He knew that. It was clear to him. And he wanted that figure to do its best. Again, if you're focused and concentrating on Pac-Man doing his best, he'll do better because you're focusing on what he needs to do. Jesus focused on what he needed to do. He knew he needed to fill himself with the Spirit. How? Well, it's all these teachings, including forgive them, they know not what they do, which is, again, high-end spiritual teaching, but also really cool physics and obvious, what I like to think of as logical mental health. People are always doing the best that they know how to do based upon the energy that's inside of them. If the lawnmower is empty, you don't blame the lawnmower for not being able to run. It's the gas that needs to make it run. Every being that does something, including us, that does something that we might call sinful or evil, only does it because they're feeling the darkness within. The darkness is what's guiding them. If you add light, the darkness goes away. It's our job then, especially people that start to get this, our job is to help add light to the dark situations, like the Course in Miracles says. The only way to help another being is to see the light in them, not the darkness. I can add light to the situation, you can add light to my situation, then we'll do better together. But if all we do is see the darkness, then we're going to perpetuate that. So forgive them, they know not what they do. The forgiveness we understand for the most part, but know not what they do, that's called ignorance. People don't realize they're not running on the proper fuel. People are so invested in their egos and like to argue about it. This is the right way to do it. I know because my daddy and his daddy before him told me how to do it. And then we must follow this because our family has been doing this for thousands of years. Not so effective, and that's why the world is in the situation that it's in. The bunch of egos are running the show. Those who connect to the Spirit again add a different dynamic, and that's what Jesus was trying to do. We should forgive people, not because they're bad. I like the way the Course in Miracles teaches it. In fact, no one's ever done anything bad. It's always done out of ignorance. And that's the only way to do it, to always see the light in people. And after this is of course on the cross, he says, today you'll be with me in paradise. To me, that's a good reason to not worry. Takes the pressure off. To Jesus, eternity is right now. It's always about right now. Today, he says, granted, he said it to the thief next to him on the cross, but he's saying it to each of us. By the time our game is over, it'll still feel like today to our higher self. Just like when you go to bed at night and have a dream and you wake up and it's that same day, maybe a few minutes later. The sensation of tapping into the higher self and then physically dying, it feels like today. There's no pressure, there's no hurry. As Einstein describes over here in timelessness, time doesn't even exist like we think. And that's very useful to think of us. It's a fait accompli. That enemy of yours that you don't like, he'll eventually figure it out. Today, he'll be in paradise too. Your job, as I've said many times when Buddha's last words come to mind, figure yourself out. What did Jesus say? Don't worry about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your own. Okay? Figure out your connection to source. That's all we're supposed to be doing. And then, why have you forsaken me? That's so relatable. I'd like to say that's the most important thing that was ever said in human history. Jesus himself, or God incarnate, said, why have you forsaken me? Why? It's so relatable because this is tough work. It's very difficult, especially for the spiritual person, to get to a place where, it all is going to go smoothly. That's not how it goes. Jesus himself doubted. He felt forsaken by God. Boy, is that relatable, because we're going to go through that too. In fact, we're going to go through it a lot. The beauty of that line is what he said next, which is, I thirst. That he knew, again, was he thirsty for water? Of course he was thirsty for water, but that's physical orientation. What he was thirsty was for more spirit. That's Mas Christ. Okay? Christmas is about bringing more spirit into us. That's it. Jesus knew that. He asked for more. And after that, he said it is finished, because you ask for more, you get more, spiritually speaking. Ask for a big bag of gold, good luck. Ask for more spirit, you get more spirit. Ask to see the world spiritually, the universe shows you spirit. Seek it, you will find it, right? So I thirst. Now, if I did any more, that's Easter. We'll do that at Easter time, okay? So we'll go to what the contrary nature of all this huggy, hippie stuff, forgiving and merciful and all that, is when he says you have to hate your family. Remember, this is Luke 14:26 and Matthew 10:34. He says, literally, you have to hate your family. Look it up if you don't believe me. Don't hear that in church very often. Why does he say that? I put hate in quotes because that's important. He didn't speak English, okay? Aramaic, and when I looked up the root of the word, it really emphasizes a preference quality. But he goes on and explains these verses. If you put your family before the spirit, you're going to be stuck in the ego mode all the time. And you're also going to think the world's not fair. If you put your friends before your enemies, you're going to not have the spirit. You're not perceiving unity. You're perceiving separation. I like this person more than that person. This person is better than that person. That means no spirit. In order to get there, you actually have to put, this is Abraham and Isaac too, sacrificing your child, metaphor, okay, not literal. The fact is if you're not willing to sacrifice the lower self, as he says, you have to hate your own life. If you're not willing to crucify the ego, then you won't attain the spirit. We have to be ready. What's it say?
Low battery.
Okay, thank you. I think it should still be working, but I'll check just in case. What's that?
It is red, so it's still recording.
Yeah, that's fine. Everybody out there will work with it just fine, but it'll get me to speed up too. And a man's foes will be those of his own household. That means we're literally engaging with ego conflict with inside our families all the time. It's not just physical family. Of course, it's friends and neighbors and all that too. And that's to be expected. That's part of the process. Why do we suffer? Because we look at it from the ego's perspective. The Spirit says, you got this. Everyone's learning, everyone's growing. It's all good. You all come from the same source. Be patient, be forgiving, be understanding, all of that. Right? And so the teaching, while it sounds pretty aggressive, it ends up being the rest of this stuff. It's the same thing. It ends up being Spirit. He says you must pick up your cross and carry it. It's a must. It doesn't mean you just have to believe that my mother was a virgin. He never said that once. He never emphasized what so many people emphasize, the virgin birth. He never mentioned it. You'd think he would have if it was that big of a deal. And I'm not saying it's not a big deal. And if you believe in it and it's important to you, keep it that way. I'm just saying Jesus never mentioned it. What it really means, pick up the cross. Your physical body's likened to under a cross. The burdens that you carry in life is likened under the cross. We are going to experience it. But if you experience it and you detach from it and you learn how to let go through forgiveness and mercy, those types of things, he says you will lose your life in order to find your life. You lose the ego life and you find the spiritual life. It's what he's saying directly. It's why John says, I must decrease so he may increase. We have what we thought was our life turn into something else. And that's the spiritual life. And that's why it's a requirement to pick up your cross and carry it and follow after me. Because we have to do the things that he did, not physically, but spiritually. And then, aggressively again, he tells the Christians, or not the Christians, but the people who believed in him, when they say, Lord, please save me, he'll say, depart from me, I never knew you. But they said, we did so many great works in your name. And he says, I don't even know who you are. That's very, very assertive / aggressive that he's saying to otherwise believers. Why is that? You don't come to God with the ego. You don't come to God with, I did this. See, the Holy Spirit does it all. You let the Holy Spirit in you, the Holy Spirit will take care of things. I told you all about that vision / dream I had a couple months ago with Bruce Springsteen. And at the end of it, the Holy Spirit said, I solve everything. And I'm like, wow, that was powerful for me. And why is that? Because it's the Holy Spirit that does the healing. Not me. I've never helped anyone. Okay? None of us actually ever help anyone. But if the Holy Spirit's in you, that does the healing. Because that energy gets exchanged. That's the entanglement aspect. There's that fun Einstein stuff. And if you have more Holy Spirit and you practice all the virtues, of course you're going to feel healthier. And doing it to such a degree that you feel changed is called being born again. You must be born again, Jesus says. You're born once of flesh and the second time of spirit. And it was the very, his fellow teachers of the day that were confused, Nicodemus, were confused by this. How do I get born again? How do I get back up in my mother's womb? That's so odd. But he's looking at it physically. To be born again is to realize you're a spiritual being, not a physical one. And to realize you're a spiritual being is to add spirit to the system, right? The more spirit I put in this, if my eye is single, my whole body's filled with light. The more you have the awareness of like, oh, I get it. Now I'm not Steve, white American dude. I'm similar to Ahmed, and I'm similar to Louise. I'm similar to all of you. All of us are very similar. In fact, we come from the same source. That's Krishna again, perceiving the unity in all things. And so that's the born again process. And what happens there? That's when Jesus says, you are the light. When Jesus, the second coming, the idea of him coming back is when the Christ appears inside of all of us. And this is the meaning of Christmas, when Christ is born inside of us. It's also the second coming, but now that which is Jesus is in you. And it's not the physical return. And again, if that works for you, have at it. But what really happens is the Christ enters. And that is the second coming. That is the rebirth quality, okay? And that is also more Christ. And that is Merry Christmas, okay? Because you have more Christ inside of you when you realize the very same process and experience that Jesus had of the filling of the light. Again, Luke 2:52, grew in stature and favor with God and man. That's our process. We will have plenty of forsaken feelings and I thirst feelings, right? But when we apply ourselves to the forgiveness and the mercy and the loving the neighbor and the enemies and all of our adversities and all of that, once we do that, we end up having the exact same experience. that Jesus had, and that is the birth of Christ inside of all of us.